What happens when a man who has everything decides he's entitled to even more? We're talking about Richard Sterling, the tech mogul billionaire. A man who graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune. He thought his divorce would be a simple transaction, a footnote in his legendary career. That's why he had the audacity to walk into the Supreme Court, not just with his high-powered legal team, but with his much younger mistress, Sienna, clinging to his arm. He smirked at his wife of 20 years, Penelope expecting her to crumble. But he made one catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot who he was dealing with. What the judge revealed next wasn't just a legal bombshell. It was an explosion that vaporized an empire and exposed a lie 2 decades in the making. The sterile wood-paneled courtroom buzzed with the low hum of anticipation. It wasn't just another high-asset divorce. It was a public execution, or so Richard Sterling intended. He made his entrance as if walking onto a red carpet, dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than the average car. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and a Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist as he waved away a throng of reporters. But the real spectacle was the woman on his arm. Sienna Carmichael, a 25-year-old Instagram model with eyes as blue and vacant as a chlorinated pool, was poured into a crimson dress that left little to the imagination. She held Richard's hand possessively, her diamond bracelet, a recent gift, catching the harsh courthouse lighting and scattering it like shrapnel. They were a portrait of audacious disrespect, a living, breathing insult to the woman sitting alone on the opposite bench. That woman was Penelope Hayes. At 48, Penelope looked to the untrained eye like a woman faded by time and quiet suburban life. Her charcoal grey suit was tasteful but not flashy. Her brown hair was pulled back into a simple, elegant chignon. She wore no ostentatious jewelry, only the thin gold wedding band that now felt like a shackle. She sat with a ramrod-straight posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap. To Richard, she was a relic of his past, the starter wife who had served her purpose and was now an obstacle to his new life. He looked at her and felt a flicker of pity quickly extinguished by annoyance. This whole process was a tedious waste of his valuable time. His lawyer, Alistair Finch, a shark in a Savile Row suit, leaned in. "It's all in hand, Richard. We've offered her a generous settlement, 20 million the Hamptons house, and an annuity. Far more than she's entitled to. She has no claim on Sterling Innovations. The company is yours, built by your genius. The judge will see that. Her refusal to accept is just greed." Richard nodded his gaze, flicking dismissively towards Penelope. $20 million is a rounding error for me, Alistair, but it's the principle. She didn't build a single thing. She planned dinner parties and redecorated the houses I paid for. She should be grateful. He caught Penelope's eye across the courtroom. He expected to see fear, sadness, perhaps desperation. Instead, he saw nothing. A calm, placid lake. It was unnerving. He had always been able to read her, to manipulate her quiet nature. But this version of Penelope was a stranger. His mistress Sienna squeezed his hand. "Don't let her bother you, baby." She whispered, her voice loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Soon this will all be over, and we can finally be together properly. Just think of the yacht in Monaco." Richard gave her a reassuring smile, the one he reserved for magazine photographers. He felt powerful, invincible. He was Richard Sterling, the visionary behind Sterling Innovations, a tech behemoth worth an estimated $12 billion. He had started with nothing but an idea and raw ambition. Penelope had been there, yes, a supportive partner in the early lean years. But support didn't equate to equity. Love didn't translate to stock options. On the other side of the aisle, Penelope's lawyer, Ava Chen, a sharp-witted woman with an unassuming demeanor and a mind like a steel trap, placed a hand on her client's shoulder. "Are you ready, Penelope?" Penelope took a slow, deep breath and finally looked away from her husband. "I've been ready for a long time, Ava," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Let's begin." The bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Davies presiding." A stern, intelligent-looking woman in her late 60s took the bench. Judge Davies had a reputation for being meticulous fair and utterly immune to the theatrics of wealth and power. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on Richard and Sienna, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression, before settling on the documents before her. "We are here today to hear the divorce proceedings of Sterling versus Hayes." Judge Davies began, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Finch, you may begin." Alistair Finch stood up, radiating confidence. He launched into a grand narrative of Richard Sterling, the self-made titan of industry. He painted a picture of a man who worked 100-hour weeks, who risked everything on a dream, while his wife enjoyed the fruits of his labor. He presented Penelope as a traditional homemaker, who, while appreciated for her domestic contributions, had no role, no input, and no legal claim on the colossal enterprise that was Sterling Innovations. "Your Honor," Finch concluded with a flourish, "Mr. Sterling, in his immense generosity, has made an offer that far exceeds the legal requirement for a spouse in her position. We ask the court to validate this settlement and finalize this dissolution so both parties can move on." Judge Davies listened patiently, her face impassive. When Finch sat down, she turned her gaze to the other table. "Ms. Chen, your response—" Ava Chen rose. She was the antithesis of Finch. No grand gestures, no booming rhetoric. She spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we reject Mr. Sterling's generous offer. We reject it not because it is insufficient, but because it is based on a fundamentally false premise." A murmur went through the courtroom. Richard shifted in his seat, a frown creasing his brow. Finch jumped to his feet. "Objection. Ms. Chen is casting aspersions. The premise is fact. Mr. Sterling founded and built Sterling Innovations." "Is it a fact, Mr. Finch?" Ava Chen asked, turning her head slightly. "Or is it just a very well-told story?" Judge Davies held up a hand. "I'll allow it. Proceed, Ms. Chen. But be warned, your argument had better be grounded in evidence." "Thank you, Your Honor," Ava said. "It is. The evidence we will present today will prove that my client Penelope Hayes is not entitled to half of Sterling Innovations." Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair. He exchanged a triumphant glance with Sienna. He knew it. Penelope's lawyer was admitting defeat. Ava Chen paused for a beat, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering the blow. "My client is not entitled to half of the company." She repeated, her voice ringing with clarity. "Because she already owns all of it." The courtroom erupted 22 years earlier, 2003. The story Richard Sterling told himself and the world began in a dusty garage in Palo Alto. The reality began in a small, cramped apartment in a less fashionable part of town, with peeling paint and a window that overlooked a brick wall. Richard was a bartender back then, brimming with charisma and grand ideas, but lacking the discipline or the capital to make them reality. He was handsome, charming, and could talk his way into or out of anything. He dreamt of being a tech visionary, like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, But his days were spent pouring drinks, and his nights were spent sketching out half-baked business plans on cocktail napkins. He met Penelope Hayes at a university library. She wasn't a student there. She was a freelance coder and data analyst, a ghost in the machine for several burgeoning tech startups. She was brilliant, but intensely private. While Richard was a firework, all noise and bright light, Penelope was a deep, quiet river. She had a mind that saw patterns and possibilities where others saw only chaos. She had come from a family of academics, people who valued intellect over attention. They fell in love quickly. He was drawn to her quiet strength and her sharp mind, which he found exotic. She was drawn to his boundless energy and his unshakable belief in himself, a confidence she had always lacked. One evening over cheap takeout Chinese food, Richard was passionately explaining his latest idea, a software platform that could streamline supply chain logistics for small businesses. It was a good idea, but it was just that, an idea. He had no code, no model, no capital. Penelope listened patiently, then walked over to her beaten-up desktop computer. "The core problem isn't just streamlining," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's predictive analysis. You need a system that doesn't just track inventory, but predicts demand based on dozens of variables, market trends, weather patterns, social media sentiment. That's the real value." Over the next 6 months, while Richard continued to work at the bar, Penelope dedicated herself to building the foundation of that system. She wrote the core algorithm, a piece of code so elegant and powerful it was years ahead of its time. She worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a silent, burning ambition of her own. She called the project Nexus. The problem, as always, was money. They needed servers, patents, a small office, and at least one other programmer. They were flat broke. "We could try to find venture capitalists," Richard suggested, frustrated. "But they'll want 80% of the company before we've even started." That's when Penelope revealed her secret. "My parents," she began hesitantly. "They weren't wealthy, but they were very careful. They left me a trust fund when they passed away. It's managed by Morgan Stanley." Richard's eyes widened. "A trust fund, Penny? Why didn't you tell me how much?" "It's significant," she said. "Around $2 million. But there are conditions. My father was very protective. The trust was structured so that the capital could only be used for a business venture where I was the sole proprietor. He didn't trust anyone else with my future." Richard's face fell. His dream right there, but locked behind a door he couldn't open. Sole proprietor, so. "I'm out." Penelope looked at him, at the man she loved, whose ambition she wanted to nurture. She saw his charisma, his ability to sell a vision to be the face of an enterprise in a way she never could be. She hated public speaking, hated networking. He thrived on it. They were two halves of a whole. She had a plan that was both a loving sacrifice and a masterfully strategic move. "No," she said softly. "Not out. We form the company. A Delaware C Corp. Legally, on all the incorporation documents filed with the state, I will be listed as the 100% shareholder funded directly from the trust as per its bylaws. This satisfies the legal requirement of the trust." She paused, taking his hands. "But publicly, Richard, it will be your company. We'll call it Sterling Innovations. You will be the CEO, the president, the chairman. You will be the face and the voice. We'll draw up a private internal agreement just between us. It will state that you are the acting CEO, granted a generous salary and a significant performance-based bonus structure tied to the company's growth. We'll even call your bonus profit sharing so you feel like an owner, but the equity, the actual ownership, that has to remain with me to unlock the funds. Richard was hesitant. So I'd be an employee. Your employee. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. You'd be the leader, she corrected gently. The visionary. No one ever has to know about the legal structure. This is just paperwork to satisfy my father's lawyers. In the real world, in the press to our future employees, you are the founder. I'll stay in the background as Chief Technology Officer, maybe. I prefer the work anyway, not the spotlight. It's the only way, Richard. It's our only path. Blinded by the sudden proximity of $2 million and the promise of his name in lights, Richard agreed. He saw it as a temporary legal hurdle, a formality. In his mind, his vision and her money were merging. Over time, that distinction would blur until it vanished completely. They signed 2 sets of documents that week. The first were the public-facing incorporation papers for Sterling Innovations, which listed Richard Sterling as CEO and president. The second was a deeply confidential ironclad private agreement drafted by the trust's attorneys. It explicitly stated Penelope Hayes was the sole capital contributor and 100% owner of all shares, and that Richard Sterling was an employee at will, granted the title of CEO. It was notarized and filed away in a safe deposit box at a bank managed by the trust. And so Sterling Innovations was born. Fueled by Penelope's capital and built on the foundation of her code, but with Richard Sterling's name on the door. He was a brilliant salesman, and he sold the story of the self-made man to the world, and eventually even to himself. The first 10 years were a whirlwind of success. Richard, freed from financial constraints and powered by Penelope's revolutionary software, was unstoppable. He was a master at networking, at wooing investors for secondary rounds of funding, all of which were legally structured as debt financing or non-voting shares to avoid diluting Penelope's sole ownership, and at building a cult of personality around himself. He was the charismatic genius on the cover of magazines. Penelope, meanwhile, willingly took a back seat. She led the tech development team, working quietly and diligently out of the spotlight. She was listed on the company website as head of R&D. Most employees saw her as the quiet, slightly awkward wife of the brilliant boss. They had no idea that the entire infrastructure they worked on was the product of her mind. When they married 2 years after founding the company, she took his last name for social purposes, but legally remained Penelope Hayes on all her financial and corporate documents, a detail Richard found sentimental and never questioned. Their marriage was for a time a partnership. He was the rocket fuel, she was the guidance system. But as the company's valuation soared from millions to billions, the balance of power in their relationship began to shift, at least in Richard's mind. He started to believe his own press. He forgot the cramped apartment, the trust fund, the private agreement. He remembered only his speeches, his deals, his triumphs. He saw Penelope not as his partner, but as part of his domestic support system. The woman who ran their sprawling Atherton mansion, who raised their 2 children, who organized the charity galas that burnished his public image. Her role as head of R&D became more of an honorary title in his eyes. He promoted others above her, men who were good at corporate politics, and slowly she retreated further from the day-to-day operations, focusing on long-term strategy and new tech incubation from her home office. A gilded kin he had built for her. The first major crack appeared 5 years ago. Richard, drunk on power and adulation, began to change. He became dismissive, arrogant, and cruel in small ways. He'd mock her ideas in front of others, calling them quaint. He travelled constantly, his explanations for his whereabouts becoming vague. Then came Sienna Carmichael. Penelope discovered the affair not through a stray text message or a lipstick stain, but through a corporate expense report. She still had top-level access to the company's financials, a privilege Richard had forgotten or deemed unimportant. She saw a charge for a $50,000 diamond bracelet from Harry Winston, coded under Client Entertainment. A few clicks later, she saw charges for suites at the Four Seasons in Paris, private jet charters to St. Bart's, a lease on a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, all billed to Sterling Innovations, all for a client named Sienna Carmichael. There was a moment of profound soul-crushing pain. The betrayal was absolute. But Penelope did not cry. She did not scream. The quiet river of her personality froze over into a sheet of ice. The years of being underestimated, of being slowly erased from her own story, had forged a core of steel within her. She didn't confront him. A confrontation would have been emotional, messy, and ultimately pointless. He would lie, charm his way out of it, and paint her as a hysterical, jealous wife. Instead, she acted. She made a phone call, not to a marriage counselor, but to the top marital and corporate litigator in the state, Ava Chen. In a quiet, discreet office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, Penelope laid out the entire story. She told Ava about the early days, the trust fund, the algorithm, she wrote. And then she produced her trump card, a certified copy of the private ownership agreement retrieved from the bank's safe deposit box, where it had sat dormant for 2 decades. Ava Chen read the document, her expression shifting from professional interest to utter astonishment. She looked up at the quiet, dignified woman sitting opposite her. She wasn't just looking at a wronged wife. She was looking at the sole, undisputed owner of a multi-billion-dollar corporation who had been living as a ghost in her own machine. He's been using corporate funds to finance his affair. Penelope stated, her voice devoid of emotion. He's diluted the company's value with his recklessness and his ego. This document is ironclad, Penelope. Ava said, her mind already racing through the legal possibilities. The terms of the trust, the source of the capital, the notarized signatures. There is no ambiguity here. You own Sterling Innovations, all of it. I know, Penelope replied. When he asked for a divorce a month ago, he told me he would be fair. He offered to let me keep the house he thought he paid for. A humorless smile touched her lips. I think it's time we corrected the narrative. The strategy was set. They would let Richard file first. They would let him and his shark, Alistair Finch, lay out their entire case based on the public story. They would let him walk into court with his mistress on his arm, the pinnacle of his hubris. They would give him all the rope he needed, and then, with one simple, undeniable document, they would let him hang himself. For the next 6 months, Penelope played the part of the broken, defeated wife. She was quiet, acquiescent. She moved into the guest wing of the mansion. Richard saw it as her slow acceptance of the inevitable. He had no idea he was a king, living on borrowed time in a castle that had never been his. Back in the courtroom, the shockwave from Ava Chen's declaration, "My client already owns all of it," had subsided into a tense, disbelieving silence. Alistair Finch was on his feet, his face flushed with anger. Your Honor, this is outrageous. It's a desperate theatrical ploy. We have 2 decades of public records, tax filings, EC documents that list Mr. Sterling as the chairman and primary stakeholder. Is Ms. Chen suggesting these are all fraudulent, not fraudulent, Mr. Finch? Ava replied calmly. Just incomplete. They tell a story, but not the whole story. With the court's permission, I'd like to call Mr. Richard Sterling to the stand. Judge Davies nodded. Mr. Sterling, please approach. Richard walked to the witness stand, a look of profound irritation on his face. This was a circus. He shot a venomous glare at Penelope, who met his gaze without flinching. Ava Chen approached the stand. Mr. Sterling, thank you for your time. Let's start at the beginning. You are credited as the founder of Sterling Innovations. Is that correct? That is correct, Richard said, his voice booming with authority. And you founded it in 2003 out of your garage, with nothing but an idea and a dream. Yes, it's a well-documented story. Indeed, Ava said, picking up a file. Let's talk about the initial capitalization. A dream is wonderful, Mr. Sterling, but a company requires capital. Where did the initial seed money come from? Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. I secured private funding from personal savings and family loans. Family loans, Ava pressed. Could you specify which family members your parents were of modest means? And you were a bartender at the time, correct? I had savings, he snapped. This was over 20 years ago. I don't recall the exact details. Let me help you, Ava said, her voice turning sharp. Isn't it true that the initial capital infusion into the corporate account for Sterling Innovations on May 12, 2003, was a single wire transfer in the amount of $2 million? Richard's eyes narrowed. That sounds approximately correct. And isn't it true, Ava continued, walking towards the clerk, that this wire transfer did not come from your personal account or from any of your family members, but rather from a trust account managed by Morgan Stanley, an account held in the name of one Penelope Hayes? She handed a document to the clerk. Your Honor, I submit as Exhibit A a certified statement from Morgan Stanley detailing the 2003 transfer. Judge Davies examined the document. Alastair Finch rushed over to look at it, his face paling slightly. This money was a gift, Richard stammered from the stand. A gift from my then-girlfriend to help start my company. She believed in me. A gift, Ava mused. A $2 million gift with no paperwork. That seems unlikely. But let's move on. Let's talk about the core product. The Nexus logistics algorithm that was the foundation of the company's success. You've often referred to it as your brainchild. I conceived of the platform, Richard said defensively. I set the vision. But you didn't write the code, did you, Mr. Sterling? You have no programming background. I had a team. And who led that team? Who wrote the initial 70,000 lines of code for the base algorithm? Ava asked. Richard fell silent. He glanced at Penelope, who was watching the exchange with the quiet intensity of a hawk. You don't know, do you? Ava pressed. The person who wrote that code was Penelope Hayes. She worked for 18 hours a day for 6 months in your tiny apartment to build the very engine of the company you call yours. Objection, Finch shouted. Relevance. This is ancient history. It is the most relevant history there is. Your Honor, Judge Davies said, her eyes fixed on Richard. Objection overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Sterling. Penelope. She handled the technical side. Richard mumbled, his voice losing its confident timbre. That was her role. Her role, Ava repeated. And what was your role exactly besides setting the vision? I was the CEO. I built the business. I made the deals, hired the people. I put us on the map. He boomed, his frustration boiling over. That company is worth $12 billion. Because of me. So you believe you are entitled to the fruits of that success? Absolutely 100%. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Ava said softly. You've been very clear. She walked back to her table as Richard, fuming, stepped down from the stand. He thought he had weathered the storm. He thought it was just a pathetic attempt to embarrass him. He sat down next to Sienna and took her hand, trying to project an aura of calm control. He was still the king. Ava Chen stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling's testimony has been illuminating. He believes the company is his because he was the public face, the deal-maker. He has conveniently forgotten who provided the seed capital and the foundational technology. But feelings and public narratives are not what matters in this court. Legally binding agreements are. She picked up a single leather-bound document from her table. Mr. Sterling mentioned that Penelope's $2 million was a gift. That is false. It was an investment from her family trust, an investment that came with strict, non-negotiable conditions. The primary condition was that Penelope Hayes must be the sole legal proprietor of any venture funded by it. Alistair Finch laughed out loud, a short, sharp, disbelieving bark. This is absurd. If such a thing were true, there would be a document. And after 20 years of SEC filings and audits, such a document would have surfaced. It does not exist. Ava Chen looked at him, a slight, almost pitying smile on her face. Oh, but it does exist, Mr. Finch, she said. It has simply been waiting for the right moment to be seen. She walked towards the judge's bench, the leather-bound document held in her hand, like a sacred text. Your Honor, I present Exhibit B, the private shareholder and executive employment agreement for Sterling Innovations, dated May 14, 2003, executed by the attorneys of the Hayes Family Trust. The room fell into a deathly silence. Every eye was on that document. Richard Sterling stared at it, his mind refusing to process what was happening. That forgotten piece of paper, that formality from 2 decades ago. It couldn't be. This document, Ava announced, her voice resonating in the still air, was a precondition for the release of the trust funds. It stipulates in clear, unambiguous language that 100% of the founding shares of Sterling Innovations are the sole property of Penelope Hayes. It further stipulates that Mr. Richard Sterling is appointed as Chief Executive Officer, an employee at will for a designated salary and a performance-based bonus package. She handed the document to Judge Davies. It is signed, Your Honor, by Penelope Hayes and by Richard Sterling. The silence in the courtroom was so profound, it felt like a physical weight. All the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard Sterling sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of chalky disbelief. The bravado, the arrogance, the smug certainty, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, primal panic. His eyes were wide, fixed on the document now in Judge Davies's hands, as if it were a venomous snake. Sienna Carmichael beside him finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Her perfectly manicured hand slipped from Richard's arm. The billionaire she had attached herself to was suddenly looking small. Alistair Finch, for the first time in his illustrious career, was utterly speechless. He looked from Ava Chen's calm, triumphant face to his client's crumbling facade. He had been played. He had built his entire case on a foundation of sand, and the tide was now coming in. Judge Davies spent what felt like an eternity examining the document. She read every line, her expression unreadable. She turned the pages slowly, her gaze lingering on the final page with the 2 signatures, side by side, from a different lifetime. One Penelope's was neat and precise. The other Richard's was a confident, flamboyant scrawl, the signature of a man who believed he was signing a mere formality on his way to greatness. Finally, she looked up, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom before landing squarely on Richard. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "is this your signature?" She had the clerk carry the document over to the defense table. Richard stared at it. He couldn't deny it. It was his. He remembered that day now, a vague, hazy memory of signing a stack of papers in a stuffy lawyer's office. He had been so focused on the $2 million on the future on the name Sterling Innovations that the fine print had seemed irrelevant. Penelope had told him it was just a legal hoop to jump through for her family's trust. He had trusted her, or rather he hadn't cared enough to distrust her. I signed it," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. But it was a formality, an understanding. The company was always meant to be mine. An understanding does not supersede a legally binding contract. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Davies said sternly, "especially not one drafted by trust attorneys and executed as a condition of a multi-million-dollar investment. This document is not an understanding. It is an instrument of ownership." She turned to Alistair Finch. "Miss Finch, do you have any evidence to refute the validity of this agreement?" Finch, pale and flustered, could only shake his head. "No, Your Honor. We were unaware of this document's existence." The admission was a death knell for his case. Judge Davies leaned forward, her gaze withering. "Then let me be perfectly clear for everyone in this room. The story of the self-made man, Richard Sterling, is a fiction. A compelling fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. The evidence presented today is irrefutable. The seed capital for Sterling Innovations came from a trust belonging solely to Penelope Hayes. The foundational intellectual property was created solely by Penelope Hayes. And the legal ownership of 100% of the company was and has always been vested solely with Penelope Hayes, as stipulated by this contract, signed by Mr. Sterling himself. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Richard looked like he had been physically struck. He turned to look at Penelope. For the first time he saw her, not the faded wife or the quiet homemaker, but the architect of his entire life. The silent queen who had let him play king in her castle. The placid lake he'd looked at earlier was a deep, dark ocean, and he was just now realizing he had been drowning in it for 20 years. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was absolute, unshakable power. Therefore, Judge Davies continued, her voice rising to a declarative boom. The court finds the following. Sterling Innovations is not a marital asset to be divided. It is and always has been the sole and separate property of Ms. Penelope Hayes. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Mr. Sterling's claims to ownership of the company are hereby dismissed. As he is legally an employee of the company owned by Ms. Hayes, his position, salary, and any bonuses are subject to her discretion as the sole owner and director. As for the division of actual marital assets, those acquired jointly during the marriage outside of the company, that will be divided according to state law. This includes the primary residence, which records show was purchased with funds from Ms. Hayes's personal accounts and other joint investments. The hammer fell. It wasn't just that he had lost the company. He had lost everything. The houses, the jets, the lavish lifestyle, it was all funded by the company. Her company. He wasn't the billionaire owner. He was the overpaid CEO who had just been exposed in the most public way imaginable. His worth wasn't $12 billion. It was effectively zero. Sienna Carmichael stood up so abruptly, her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Without a word, without a single backward glance at the man whose fortune had just vanished, she turned and walked briskly out of the courtroom, her red dress a retreating flag of surrender. The diamond bracelet on her wrist, purchased with corporate funds, now belonged to the woman she had sneered at. Richard Sterling slumped in his chair, a broken man. The reporters in the gallery were scribbling furiously, their faces alight with the story of a lifetime. The Titan had fallen. Judge Davies banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." The aftermath was a media firestorm. "The Phantom Billionaire," screamed the cover of the Wall Street Journal. "How the CEO's wife was the secret owner all along," read the headline in the New York Times. Richard Sterling's fall from grace was brutal, public, and absolute. He became a cautionary tale, a punchline in late-night monologues. The man who had it all and flew too close to the sun, only to discover the sun was never his to begin with. Stripped of his corporate credit cards, his chauffeured Maybach, and his access to the private jet, he was adrift. Alistair Finch dropped him as a client the next day. His powerful friends stopped returning his calls. He was a pariah. The final divorce settlement left him with a fraction of what he had expected his personal effects, and a small portion of a joint savings account. It was more money than most people see in a lifetime, but for a man accustomed to billions, it was poverty. The day after the verdict, Penelope Hayes walked through the gleaming glass doors of the Sterling Innovations headquarters in Silicon Valley. She was no longer dressed in the muted tones of a courtroom observer. She wore a sharply tailored power suit in a deep shade of sapphire blue, her hair down her stride, confident and purposeful. The lobby fell silent as she entered. Employees who had only ever seen her as the boss's wife at company picnics now stared in awe and confusion. She didn't pause. She walked directly to the bank of private elevators, used her old R&D keycard, which still granted her top-level access, and ascended to the top floor. She stepped out into the opulent executive suite. The vast corner office, with its panoramic views of the valley, was empty. The personal effects, the framed magazine covers, featuring his face, the photos of him with world leaders, the gaudy sculptures had already been boxed up and removed. All that remained was the desk. Her desk. She walked over and ran a hand over the smooth, polished wood. For 20 years, she had allowed another person to sit here to take credit for her work, her capital, her creation. It had been a choice born of love, then sustained by strategy. Now it was over. Her first act as the official public owner of the company was to call an all-hands meeting. Standing before the thousands of employees who had believed Richard's story, she didn't gloat or denigrate her ex-husband. She simply told the truth. For 20 years, this company has had a public face and a private engine, she said, her voice clear and steady. Today they become one. My name is Penelope Hayes, and I am the founder and owner of this company. Our work in predictive logistics has changed the world, but our potential is even greater. The era of ego is over. The era of true innovation begins now. She immediately fired the sycophants Richard had promoted and elevated the brilliant engineers and strategists, many of them women, whom he had overlooked. She greenlit projects he had dismissed as too risky. She announced a new company name, shedding the one that was now synonymous with disgrace. Sterling Innovations was dead. From its ashes rose Nexus Analytics, a callback to the original name she had given her algorithm in that tiny apartment all those years ago. The company under her focused and visionary leadership didn't just survive, it thrived. The market, initially spooked, responded with overwhelming confidence to the story of the quiet genius finally taking her rightful place. The stock soared. Penelope Hayes never set out for revenge. She had only wanted what was hers. But in reclaiming her company, she reclaimed her life, her identity, and her story. She was no longer Richard Sterling's wife, a footnote in his biography. She was Penelope Hayes, the woman who built an empire in silence, and then, when the time was right, stepped into the light to claim her throne. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell, shattering one life and forging another. The name Sterling was now a toxic asset, a synonym for hubris and public humiliation. In its place, Nexus Analytics was ascending a testament to the quiet, formidable woman who now rightfully occupied the CEO's chair. The world, it turned out, loved the story of the ghost in the machine emerging to claim her kingdom. The company's valuation had not only stabilized, but had climbed by 15%, as Penelope's steady, no-nonsense leadership reassured a market weary of her ex-husband's erratic showmanship. From her office on the 50th floor, Penelope Hayes looked out over the sprawling Silicon landscape. The panoramic view was the same, but the person looking out was entirely different. The weight of her new role was immense. Her days were no longer spent in the quiet solitude of Kortgul and data models, but in a relentless whirlwind of board meetings, investor calls, and strategic planning sessions. She was the public face, now the final authority. The buck in its entirety stopped with her. She had just concluded a tense video conference with her new European operations chief, dissecting supply chain vulnerabilities in the Baltic states. She was good at it. Her mind, so adept at seeing patterns in data, could easily see the flow of global commerce. But it was draining in a way her old work never was. The solitude she once cherished was now a luxury. Her intercom buzzed. It was her assistant. "Ms. Hayes, your son Leo is here to see you." A rare, genuine smile touched Penelope's lips. "Send him in, please." Leo, her 20-year-old son, walked in. He had her thoughtful eyes, but Richard's easy charm, a combination that Penelope found both endearing and slightly painful. He was a junior at Stanford, and his visits were her anchor to a world outside of corporate warfare. "Hey, Mom," he said, slumping into one of the plush chairs opposite her massive desk. "This place still looks like a spaceship." "It's a bit much, isn't it?" she conceded. "I'm thinking of redecorating. Less Bond villain, more functional workspace." They talked for a few minutes about his classes and his plans for the summer, but Penelope could sense a tension in him, a familiar unease that had been present since the divorce. "What is it, Leo?" she finally asked gently. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I saw Dad last week." Penelope's posture stiffened slightly. She made it a point never to speak ill of Richard to their children Leo and his younger sister Clara. She wanted them to form their own opinions, but it was difficult. "How is he?" she asked, her voice neutral. "He's different," Leo said, struggling for the right words. "He's living in a condo in Russian Hill. It's nice, but it's not, you know. He talks a lot. About you. About the past." Leo hesitated, then looked at her directly. "Mom, he says you planned it all from the beginning, that you set him up, let him build everything just so you could take it away. He's telling everyone who will listen that he's the victim." Penelope felt a familiar ache. "Leo, what your father and I had. It was complicated. The ownership agreement was a legal necessity at the start. I never intended for this." "But did you have to humiliate him?" Leo pressed his voice, cracking with a son's pain. In court with the mistress there, in front of the whole world. He has nothing left. He made his choices, Leo. Penelope said, her voice firm, but not unkind. He chose to have an affair. He chose to use company money to fund it. He chose to file for divorce and try to leave me with a pittance of what we built. He chose to walk into that courtroom holding her hand. That wasn't my decision. My only choice was whether to lie down and be erased or to stand up and claim what was legally and morally mine. I chose to stand up for myself and for you and Clara. Leo looked down, conflicted. I know. It's just, he's plotting something, Mom. He's not the kind of man who just fades away. He's met someone, not a woman. Some finance guy, a hedge fund manager named Damien Croft. Dad's been feeding him information about Nexus. Penelope felt a chill run down her spine. Damien Croft. The name was infamous. Croft was a corporate raider, a vulture who specialized in hostile takeovers of vulnerable companies. What kind of information? She asked, her mind instantly shifting into strategic mode. I don't know the details, Leo admitted. Just that Dad thinks he's found a way to get justice. He says you're a tech nerd, not a business leader, and that this Croft fellow is going to expose you and take the company apart. The conversation was cut short by the urgent buzz of her private line. It was Ava Chen. That in itself was a warning sign. Ava didn't call unless it was critical. Penelope, Ava's voice was grim. We have a problem. A big one. Meanwhile, in a sleek, minimalist condominium overlooking Alcatraz, Richard Sterling swirled a glass of expensive whiskey he hadn't paid for. He looked thinner, his face etched with a bitterness that had aged him more than the past 10 years of success ever had. He was a king in exile, and he was consumed by a singular burning purpose vengeance. Across from him sat Damien Croft. Croft was a man in his 40s with cold reptilian eyes and an unnerving stillness. He didn't exude power like Richard once had. He absorbed it from the rooms he entered. He was everything Richard wasn't: patient, meticulous, and utterly devoid of ego. Your ex-wife's rebranding has been surprisingly effective, Croft said, his voice a low monotone. The market likes the narrative. The hidden genius story plays well. It's a fraud, Richard spat. She's a backroom coder who got lucky. She can't handle the pressure of a global enterprise. I know her weaknesses. I built that company's infrastructure. I know where the stress points are. For the past 3 months, Richard had been Croft's oracle. He had detailed every acquisition, every international deal, every piece of corporate debt Richard had taken on during his aggressive expansion phase. He painted a picture of a company stretched thin, a house of cards built by his own daring, now being managed by a timid amateur. Her biggest weakness, Richard continued, leaning forward with a conspiratorial gleam in his eye, is that she despises debt. She's risk-averse. I took on billions in leveraged financing to fund the Asian expansion. She never approved. The covenants on those bonds are complex. If the company's bond rating slips even a single grade, it triggers massive penalty clauses. Pressure it, and the whole thing will start to creak. Croft listened, absorbing every word. My fund has been acquiring that debt quietly for months. He revealed a faint smile, touching his thin lips. We now hold a controlling interest in Nexus Analytics' corporate bonds, over 60% of them. Richard's eyes widened. You do? Yes, Croft said. And tomorrow, we will be making a public tender offer to buy the company. It will be a lowball offer, of course. She will reject it. But the offer itself, combined with our position as her primary creditor, will be enough to spook the ratings agencies. We will issue a statement questioning her leadership and the company's future profitability. When the rating slips, the penalties kick in. The stock will plummet. Then we make our real move. Richard felt a surge of euphoric power he hadn't felt in months. He was back in the game. He was pulling the strings. "She won't see it coming," he whispered, a giddy, vicious smile spreading across his face. Back in her office, Penelope listened on the phone as Ava Chen laid out the grim reality. "Croft Capital just announced a hostile tender offer, Penelope. It's all over the financial news. They're citing leadership uncertainty and long-term strategic risk. It's a classic raid. He's trying to weaponize the very debt Richard saddled the company with." Penelope closed her eyes. Leo's warning echoed in her ears. "He's plotting something, Mum. This wasn't just a corporate maneuver. It was Richard's ghost reaching out from his self-imposed exile to tear down everything she had rightfully claimed. He couldn't own it, so he would see it burned to the ground." She ended the call and stood up, walking back to the vast window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She had fought and won the battle for her past. She had corrected the record and reclaimed her name. But now a new war was upon her, a war for the future of her company, her legacy. A flicker of the old fire ignited within her. The anger, the shock, it all coalesced into a familiar, cold resolve. Damien Croft thought she was a tech nerd. Richard thought she was a risk-averse amateur. They saw her as the quiet woman from the courtroom. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She turned back to her desk, her expression now hard as diamond. She pulled up every available piece of data on Croft Capital, on their strategies, their holdings, their past raids. The fight wasn't just in the boardroom anymore. It was here in the data. This was her battlefield. "You want a war, Richard?" she whispered to the empty room. "You have no idea how well I know how to fight one." What a story of poetic justice. A man so blinded by his own ego that he forgot the very foundation he was standing on was built, paid for, and owned by the woman he cast aside. Penelope Hayes played the long game, proving that true power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet, meticulous work done in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. Richard Sterling wanted to erase his wife from his life, but instead the world erased him from the history of his own company. What do you think? Was Penelope's 2-decade-long secret a brilliant strategic move or a tragedy of stolen credit? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen such a complete and total reversal of fortune? If you love stories where the underestimated rise up and justice is served cold, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life dramas. You won't believe are true. Click that notification bell so you never miss a takedown.